any relationship that I had with a substance that was that deeply intertwined with the fabric of how I functioned in my daily life, I think on the back end, those were the hardest substances to come off of. So cannabis, which, all drugs aren't created equal and they can be different. There are qualitative differences between smoking fentanyl and smoking high potency cannabis. But because the cannabis was so deeply intertwined with almost every facet of how I managed my person, on the back end, there was so many wrinkles in terms of my person that I had to iron out, that I had to figure out just to function. So that was a uniquely difficult one. And then nicotine's just a weird physiological experience and brutal to come off of. So that comes to mind, but it's all relative. I don't have to talk about my traumas. And it is a diagnostic marker of trauma not to remember your trauma. You're so overwhelmed with energies and cortisol in your body, the hippocampus pretty sensitive to cortisol, that it can, malfunction and go off. And so people are acutely, or in the instances of just severe unremitting stress, which was the case for me, my hippocampus was not working properly. And I've never had a wonderful working hippocampus. I've never been a great sleeper. So I've always been challenged in my ability to form long-term memories and learn. But there's lots of bits of my trauma that I don't remember the specifics of. But the beautiful thing about trauma healing is that's not requisite for healing from it. What we need to heal is the energies that are stuck in the here and now. Trauma is just stuck here and now energy.
Hey everyone, this week we have Joe Caravella on the show. He is a legendary Hazelden Betty Ford counselor. He has a thriving career, and he wrote a book on the disease of addiction, and he's about to write another book. I really liked his take on the brain disease of addiction and the 12 steps. It really combines like the worlds of science, the cutting edge science on addiction and brain science about addiction with kind of the 12-step spiritual model. And he just has a really strong, interesting, trendy approach to all of this stuff. And I really admire the guy. He's been through a lot. He's also a third culture kid like me. He grew up living all over the place and kind of feeling out of place in Alabama. And after one unfortunate acid trip, it was off to the races for him. And he unlocked a craving that did not stop. And he's been through a lot of different kinds of addiction. So if you're interested in different chemicals, different withdrawals, and kind of how someone would manage that, Joe's story is really good for that. And he talks a lot about the nervous system, and he answered a lot of questions that made me see things really differently about how my nervous system processes information and how I can learn to regulate that stress better. I remember watching Joe Caravella lecture in the Bigelow Auditorium at Center City, Minnesota, which is the largest and best residential treatment center in the world. It's ranked #1 year after year. It just reminded me how much that place felt like home to me. And I did my internships there, and I observed Joe's groups there, and I remember him being quite an energetic cultural force there for recovery, and people loved hearing him talk and lecture. And so I just wanted to create something that people could come back to if they want to re-listen to any of his knowledge and wisdom, and if they want kind of to hear some new stuff that he's working on, if they want to hear about some new research that he's doing to prepare for his PhD and that kind of research, you can listen to this podcast now, and you can come back and visit Joe whenever you'd like.
Thanks, Justin. James, thanks for inviting me on.
What is it like being a Hazelden Betty Ford counselor?
It's really awesome. First off, I went through our graduate program, the Hazelden Betty Ford Graduate School, as it's now called, back in 2013, and did all of my practicums, my internships up in Center City. So that was my first exposure and experience working with Hazelden counselors, and they were amazing. I've worked with Jedi after Jedi, as I call them, and I had amazing supervision. Yeah, just the world of Center City. It's a thing unto itself. It's kind of renowned as the creme de la creme of treatment centers, and that was my experience up there.
Yeah, isn't it rated like #1 in the country on some lists?
Absolutely. And the patients had that sense too when they were there, like, oh man, this is this is a high caliber place to be. This is a wonderful thing. The Betty bubble, as they call it, it's just a wonderful, huge world unto itself. It's isolated. It's out in the middle of nowhere. It's huge.
Away
Just
from the dangers of addiction.
way out there. Yeah, you got to go quite the effort to walk your tail down to Lindstrom if you want to get some booze. So yeah, real isolated, but it is like a little mini world, and it's huge by all measures in terms of treatment centers. It's just huge. It's got its own water tower. It's got its own systems. And so I graduated. Long story short, ended up getting hired on there to the Promises unit. And then about a year or two later was brought over to the Shoemaker unit, to be the lead counselor. And so I worked in residential for 6 years, and it was good. It was great. It was enormously stressful, and that's just the world of residential. We had made a transition. Our former CEO, Mark Mishik, one of his legacies was transitioning us from a primarily self-pay model to an insurance payer model. And so that opened us to the world of managed care, which most folks know and doesn't have a great reputation, is what it is. But it did broaden the scope of people that we could help. And so that's always a good thing. But the overhead on a facility like that is really high. So the costs are high for everyone involved. And so the managed care realities are pretty high stakes. And the circumstances of the people there, I think 90% of addiction services are on an outpatient basis. So the 10% that do need residential, we can probably safely assume they're of the highest acuity. So they really need to be there. Their diseases may be progressed to the extent that it's life and death. It's more than just high need withdrawal and things like that. These are persons where every dimension of the ASAM is just blown up. And I did that for 6 years. I learned a lot, worked with a lot of great people, a lot of great supervisors, a lot of great leaders, a lot of great teams. But I kind of hit my threshold, and that ran its course. And then I've been down in St. Paul, Hazelden Betty Ford, St. Paul, in a float counselor role, so covering everybody. It's a very large outpatient site. PHP, IOP, morning, evening, polysubstance, aka former Core 12 groups, LGBTQ professionals being monitored. We were talking before we started rolling here. I'm working on my LPCC, my licensed professional clinical counselor licensure, a mental health licensure, basically a master's level psychotherapist. So I'm working on that. So I've been in the deep end, learning and getting trained to cover and facilitate our mental health program at a PHP and an IOP level of care. Been case managing as well for those programs. I've learned a lot in the last 9 months. In the mental health realm, it's been really, really good. I got it so good right now at St. Paul. We have just like the best community, the best leadership, the best culture. I mean, there's just something special going on there, and it's truly a privilege to be there and going to work and working with these people and doing the things that we do fills my cup. And usually work is one of those main things that kind of takes what you got out of your cup, and it does. It's a job, and it requires a lot of attention, a lot of energy. But there's something special at this place, and I'm so happy where I'm at and what I'm doing and where I'm going. I don't know entirely what my future holds. I have some goals, I have some plans, but I couldn't ask for a better situation right now. So I don't know, being a HBFF counselor is just kind of a privilege.
I think I first met you at a Core 12 group at Center City when I was a grad student up there at Hazelden Center City, the original Hazelden, by the way.
Yeah.
If anyone didn't know. And Betty Ford, the original Betty Ford Centers in California, just giving the listeners a little backstory here. But Hazelden then bought Betty Ford Center, and they combined the names. So now we have the Center City Hazelden Betty Ford, which is the first and one of the largest, I think, if not the largest residential treatment center in the world, up here in Minnesota in the woods, just north of north of the Twin Cities. So I was going to ask you about Core 12. Why did you run that group specifically? Was there a reason for that?
Yeah, that was just kind of an extracurricular. We started Core 12, which stands for Comprehensive Opioid Response with 12-step facilitation. Um, this was the early 2010s. And Suboxone had been FDA approved for the use of opioid use disorder to start with, mainly for detox purposes. The idea of using it as a medication for addiction treatment, kind of in the manner that methadone has been for decades, as a maintenance support medication on a daily basis to help stabilize the person so that they might more productively participate in their life, not use other substances. That's kind of the idea of methadone. Works sometimes, sometimes it doesn't. That was a little bit more controversial. And then there was a lot of controversy, especially in the 12-step world, especially in the treatment world, and especially those treatment centers that were 12-step in nature, about whether the use of Suboxone was safe, whether it meant a person was quote unquote in sobriety or in recovery. And so there was an inherent stigma around medications. And so our former chief medical officer, Super Jedi, Dr. Marv Seppala, led the charge in figuring all of that out. And so Core 12 was his baby. And his idea, which was substantiated by a multi-year study that he did and published, the idea that if we combine medications and we combine 12-step therapy, if we combine mental health, really go all in on a multidisciplinary approach to treating the person with opioid use disorder, that we could increase positive outcomes. And one of the first things we noticed treating people with opioid use disorder, and this is like right on the cusp of fentanyl blowing up. That was around 2015. So the 2000s, it was all heroin and oxycodone. And then the world and the country kind of got privy to the dangers inherent in oxycodone. And so the pendulum swung from, pain was like a vital sign there for a while. And then they were like, oh my gosh, we have an epidemic here. These are extremely dangerous substances. There's a very high liability for misuse, and then tens of thousands of people dying, and so the pendulum swung the other way, and that led to the emergence of fentanyl taking the place of oftentimes legitimately prescribed oxycodone or the illicit pain mills, and those things started getting shut down. So there was just a lot of stigma, and so that was the launch of it, and it just happened to coincide with the beginning of my career. And so I was asked on Thursday, so every Tuesday and Thursday, we'd have a dedicated hour where we'd get the women, or they were gender-specific groups. I don't know if they still are up in Center City. And so I had a male-identifying Core 12 group, and it was an hour. On Thursday afternoons was mine, and I did that every Thursday for 5 years. And so we'd meet over in the Simmons community room on the other side of campus. So that must have been maybe the one where we got to hang out. And those were some of the funnest and most productive and meaningful groups that I ran over there. They were short, they were sweet. I was bringing a ton of high energy, which you got to do. Post-acute withdrawal is a reality for just about everybody in early recovery from addiction. But it's been my observation, those with, polysubstance use, especially to opioids like heroin, like oxy, like fentanyl, especially to methamphetamine use disorder, especially the high potency methamphetamine that's out there these days. And those having high comorbidity rates, fentanyl and meth, there's just high overlap of those use. I've seen that in the last number of years. Oh my gosh, like the expression of post-acute withdrawal on the back end is the most debilitating I've ever seen in all the addicted peoples that I've worked with over the years. And I've seen thousands and thousands and thousands. They are so depleted, so low, so severely downregulated, to say they're anhedonic and depressed and empty. They're like, I feel like a solid piece of lead, So how do you reach that person? How do you educate them? How do you deliver, meaningful truth and discourse and helpfulness that's actually going to stick and get consolidated into memory? And so it's just my style to be high energy and to bring a lot of oomph, and try and make them laugh and try to make it emotionally salient. And so I think it was just a great an intersection of my approach and those patients and what they need. And it was a platform for, at least at that time, I was early in my career, developing my approach, which is high energy and fun and funny. Yeah.
Yeah.
So those were good times.
Yeah, there was a lot there that I will kind of converse back about the fentanyl and the Suboxone and the medication stigma, and that's an interesting thing that I don't know if we're fully past that, but isn't it wonderful that you can see people who can take a medication that allows them to get control over their life, even if it's temporarily, instead of continuing to fall into the cravings for opioids, and I actually have a friend that's on the injectable, like the long-term one. And
yeah, Sublocade, huh?
Yeah, just trying to get off that now after many years. So It's sort of like it's a whole nother withdrawal or transition, but it's great to imagine there's something out there for people, and how debilitating the cravings can be.
Yeah, it's awful. We know that baseline dopamine, or what's called hedonic tone, should be around 50 nanograms per deciliter. Nanograms, a billionth of a gram, deciliter, a tenth of a liter. Those measurements don't really matter. It's 50 is a good day. Persons with substance use disorder, with mental illness, with post-traumatic stress, and there's a high overlap of those happening with the people that we treat. All of them have been found to have lower than normal hedonic tone. So maybe they're just percolating around 40, 45. So they're just always persistently mildly anhedonic, They're just always kind of sluggish. They have there's some prevailing sense of cognitive fog, and that's sometimes potentiated by anxiety, by the post-traumatic stress, by the major depression, which can impact baseline energy levels and focus and energy and stress. And so we know, dopamine gets severely downregulated as a result of chronic intoxication experience. All mood-altering substances are really good at honing in on relatively finite dopamine cells in our nervous system and wringing them out, And so that transient experience is unparalleled in our human experience. Using methamphetamine or MDMA can release up to 1,100 nanograms of dopamine per deciliter. So 50 is like a good day. Wake up, let's take care of business, got goals, cue the Rocky music, I got a montage, you're taking care of business, good energy. 40 is a bad day. 100 is your best day in naturally occurring land. So when we use methamphetamine or MDMA, the substances that release transiently the most dopamine, that's up to 11 times stronger than anything in our human experience. And all other substances are in the high hundreds, between 600 and 900, 1,000 nanograms per deciliter. So it feels really good and transcendent in the short term, But then on the back run, dopamine can get as low as 10 nanograms per deciliter. Wow. It's up to 40% low. So I ask a lot of people, I'm like, think about the last couple of weeks, the last couple of months that you were using. Were we really getting off? Were we really having a good time? Or were we just trying to get well? Were we just trying to normalize? And a lot of them are just like, dude, I'm just trying to normalize. They're just down at 10. They're trying to get to 50 just to feel normal. Yeah, there's studies where scientists have genetically modified rats to have next to nothing dopamine receptors. So they have way less than 10 nanograms per deciliter. And it's kind of sad, but, they're studying this. And so, dopamine's a survival chemical. It drives our basic needs. All right, I need food, so I go and get it and work hard and get my caloric intake. Dopamine drives all of that. Baseline motivation, energy, movement. There's so many things in our human experience that are regulated by dopamine. So in these rats, if you put food in their cage, but they have no dopamine receptors, they don't have the will, the intrinsic motivation to go and get the food that's maybe even right in front of them. So they'll take a spoon and put it right in front of their mouth. They don't have enough oomph to eat it. But if the scientist puts the spoon of food in their mouth, then they'll eat it.
Is that why people addicted to opioids lose their appetite and stuff? Or
there's a lot of reasons, there's a lot of substances can, impair our appetite, our HPA axis, our brainstem, our circadian rhythms, our our appetite. There's a lot of overlap with those parts of the brain and addiction. But a part of it is we have basic survival needs to be safe, to alleviate pain, for food, for sex. And then drugs and alcohol impact that part of the brain. And then eventually it hijacks that part of the brain. And to your point, indeed, using drinking will surpass your basic survival needs. And so self-care, the need to drink or drink water, to eat food, and it will take a seat to the need to use the substance. And that's why our values, our most important relationships, those things that are conducive to our survival, we are a tribe animal, will also go by the wayside, and the person's increasingly isolated, shut down, unwell, diseased, and not taking care of themselves, because survival and pleasure in the part of the brain impacted by mood altering substances does indeed hijack that part of the brain.
So what do you think are the most addictive substances? Like, what's the hardest drug you think is to quit?
Yeah, I was thinking about that question, and I think it's relative. You know, they're all pretty brutal. I've been personally addicted categorically to every substance. My first addictions were just stimulants, to amphetamine salts and dexedrine, and then MDMA. And that was a brutal year. That was a 3-year run. Did a lot of damage to my brain, a lot of neurotoxicity. Not even sure of the extent to what I've done, if I'm at a higher risk for Parkinson's later in life due to the damage, sometimes acutely, that I did to my dopamine receptors and dopamine systems. But those first 6 months after a 3-year severe stimulant use disorders, to say the least, I was a zombie, and I wasn't in a healthy place, and I wasn't working a program of recovery. I pretty much was putting all my eggs in the marijuana maintenance kind of basket. So not only did I need to recover from that severe stimulant, experience and addiction, but I don't know if I was doing myself any favors by how much pot I was smoking, which was daily and was a lot, and it was addictive in nature. And then I was addicted to oxycodone. And I don't think I ever had the money or the motivation to be as sick in that disease as I probably could have been. That's been my experience with cocaine. I was just never wealthy enough to have a really, really, compelling cocaine addiction. Coming off of alcohol was brutal, heroin addiction. But I think it's something unique coming off of nicotine. I was a heavy smoker for 15 years. I was 5 years sober, and I was like, I'm not getting a new sobriety date. I'm going to quit on my 5-year. And I did the patch, did the Wellbutrin, and I was crawling there. I was crawling out of my skin there for a while. And there is something unique about the experience of coming off of nicotine. So definitely that comes to mind. I think any drug that becomes inextricable with daily functioning, where you're like, this is a substance that helps me self-regulate. Like, this is a substance that first thing in the morning, this is how I'm going to use to motivate myself to face the day. Any relationship that I had with a substance that was that deeply intertwined with the fabric of how I functioned in my daily life, I think on the back end, those were the hardest substances to come off of. So cannabis, which, all drugs aren't created equal, and they can be different. There are qualitative differences between smoking fentanyl and smoking high potency cannabis. But because the cannabis was so deeply intertwined with almost every facet of how I managed my person, on the back end, there was so many wrinkles in terms of my person that I had to iron out, that I had to figure out just to function. So that was a uniquely difficult one. And then nicotine's just a weird physiological experience and brutal to come off of. So that comes to mind, but it's all relative.
It's interesting. So I wonder which substances, probably not all of them, are used to sort of self-soothe a part of us that's stressed out, that maybe you've just gotten more skillful at soothing without the chemicals.
Yeah. Why do we use? So I'm thinking about the research I had told you earlier that addicted people, mental illness, post-traumatic stress heavily aligns with persons having lower than normal hedonic tone. So I can picture the chart in that study where the persons are percolating down here. And so a good baseline is what's called a euthmic mood. You're like, how are you doing? I'm doing good. I'm not like riding high or manic or anything, but and I'm not low and struggling and depleted and burnt out. Like I'm really good. I'm focused. I'm energized. I'm present. That's a euthymous mood. And if you're always percolating below that, then the researchers contend those peoples are going to be more likely to more deeply resonate with things that are going to naturally elevate them.
Okay.
Because homeostasis is the name of the game, even in our nervous systems. Doesn't seem like I was born into a nervous system that's geared towards balance, and that seems to be ubiquitous for people with addictions or having that higher proclivity towards them, the trauma, the high ACE score, the mental illness, just, the tumultuous upbringings and relationships, the lack of stability. So yeah, they're just naturally lower because lots of people use drugs and alcohol. Because the question is, well, are drugs addictive? And they seem to be obviously that when I put them in my body, but the mass majority of people, upwards of 7 out of 10 people that use them, even cocaine or high potency cannabis and all of these other things that really are difficult for other people, they're able to use them or even to have misuse them, but not end up with the disease of addiction, with a substance use disorder. So I don't know. We know that they're inherently dangerous, especially for certain vulnerable persons, but I don't think I've come to believe that substances aren't inherently addictive. They're extremely addictive for people like me with a lot of vulnerabilities. So it wasn't destiny that I was going to become an addicted person. It took me about 2 years from 15 to 17, but 17, I crossed that threshold and all of my personal vulnerabilities, my low hedonic tone, my neurodivergence, my treatment-resistant depression, my autism, all these things aligned. I was more likely to deeply resonate with intoxication experience. I used them and I was like, I got itches that aren't getting scratched, And I had just been itchy my entire life. And I didn't know that because I didn't know any different. I didn't know a larger context of human experience. I just had my body, I had my nervous system, and I struggled mightily from 9 years old on. I just struggled so much. But I, just like everybody else, you do the best that you can. We're creative, we're super smart, and we get by. And then I was experimenting, and it more deeply resonated with me than a lot of my friends. And then I also had a number of friends with their own sets of struggles, and I think they had an experience similar to mine where they more deeply resonated with it, which didn't mean they immediately crossed that threshold, but they were more likely to do it. And the more you do it, and the younger you are, and the stronger the substances you're using before you have that fully developed prefrontal cortex, 20 to 25. Again, I was 17 when this was really starting to hit for me. No wonder I was that it happened, that I crossed that threshold. I lost regulatory control. I crossed over into a substance use disorder. And then regardless of what the substance was or the category, an upper, a downer, an all-arounder, I was trying to recreate that transcendent experience of feeling powerful, of feeling in control, of feeling motivated and energized and having the capacity to focus and do my work and take care of business and realize my goals. Left to my own devices, I came to find out and believe that I wouldn't be able to do that on my own. And I started using substances and this new opportunity emerged. And I wasn't super conscious to all of that. It just sort of happened. And my relationship with chemicals just got more and more reinforced because I was like, yeah, this is how I can deal with me. This is giving me some profound temporary relief to the Joe problem. And of course, I want more of that. This is motivating and energizing me to go to class, take care of business, and make some meaningful progress towards my goals. So away I went.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. Do you want to tell me a story about leading up to maybe, or just tell us any story that you want about your addiction, or like the one that kind of made you snap out of the addictive spiral, or one of them?
Yeah, I think the end of my story is the one that I focus on the most because, I've had I was addicted to stimulants, went to treatment in '02. Like I told you, I didn't take anything seriously. I put myself in treatment. No one made me go. I was like, I was psychotic. I was really bad off. I was really underweight. I quit eating. I was psychotic. I could not function at class. I was scared. I was extremely depressed. And honestly, the only reason I probably didn't die by suicide is because I didn't have the energy to do it. I was that depressed. And so a friend of mine at the time suggested I go to treatment. So I went to treatment, and I knew I wanted to get off stimulants. And in the back of my head, my plan was to just, let's go back to smoking pot. I'll be all right, and just, it made intuitive sense to me that I had an addiction. That's something that it probably constituted a disease, that something had gone massively awry. But I was in no way motivated to go to meetings or do anything as it was suggested to me in that first treatment. And so things relatively stabilized in 2003, just smoking lots of pot, going to school. But life happened, moved in with somebody, got cheated on, couldn't sublet out. I went crazy, didn't have any social support, didn't have any internal coping strategies, no meetings, no nothing. So I went crazy, and I was smoking and smoking and smoking, and it wouldn't scratch that painful itch, and reconnected with some old friends who just serendipity. A couple of weeks later, they were insufflating, snorting some oxycodone, and I'd done it before, but not a lot. And I did it, and I had immediate relief to that horrible pain that I was dealing with. And I had that light bulb moment where I was like, this is how I'm going to deal with this, in that very addicted way. And so I went all in immediately on Oxycontin and basically crossed that threshold within a week. And then I crashed and burned relatively fast with oxycodone, put myself back in treatment in August of 2004. And then I was bone dry for about 90 days. I was like, oh man, like I went up with the stimulants, I went down with the opiates, and, pot's, not the same as those guys, but danged if it didn't become my gateway drug. I think empirically these days, alcohol has been found to be the more influential gateway drug, but it could be anything for anyone, depending on the situation. And for me in that one, I was like, that's my gateway, So I stayed bone dry. I was going to a meeting a week, but I was really unmotivated. I was really isolated. I was really unwilling. I was very critical, very judgmental. I was just bone dry. I was irritable, restless, discontent. I had a lot of life happening. And long story short, I relapsed and started smoking again. I pulled a geographic and got out of Alabama, moved to Chicago, got into fashion school, and I was like, I got to hunker down. I got to finally get to business and get my arts degree, because I had essentially achieved nothing in 4 years at Auburn University studying fine arts, switching over to fashion. And so 3 years in Chicago, within several months of moving up there, I was an alcoholic. I always thought of myself as a drug guy. And then I figured out how to drink. And then once I figured out how to do that, I'm an all day, every day kind of guy. And so I started drinking every day, every night, and then I would smoke during the day to function at school and do things. And so I got into this pattern and worked while it worked until the wheels fell off. That's usually my experience in addiction. I was doing really good those first year and a half. I was killing it, nearly straight A's, So I thought I was having my addicted cake and eating it too. But then, started dabbling with cocaine, and then one day my dealer, I was going to pick up some pot from him, and he's like, I don't have any pot. And I was like, what are we doing here? I had a big bag of cocaine in my pocket, and we were about to drink that night. And he was like, well, I got heroin. And, so the next 18 months, just my whole existence was mired by severe alcoholism, liter of vodka a day, couple bags of heroin, smoking pot, smoking cigarettes, and that was what I had to do to scratch the itch. That's how I had severely progressed in my disease. That's a lot of substances, and I was doing an enormous amount of substances just to get off and try to recreate that sense of power and motivation and coping.
Maybe safety.
A sense of safety. But of course, it was conducive to none of that. My mental illness arguably has never been worse. My relationships were extremely toxic, and I was the primary toxic person driving that. My poor mom, was there giving me a place to live, so I didn't have to borrow money against living expenses, just my loans. And I put that poor woman through hell. Most anybody that was in my life during that time, to some extent, was put through hell because I was extremely addicted, extremely sick. So I finally graduated in March of 2008, but my mom was done. She paid a couple months rent on a new place, moved in there, and she moved to Maryland with my sister to put her up while she was in grad school. And nothing came of my fashion degree. I had no capacity to go out and get a job or do any of that. I had so much existential anxiety graduating college and then getting over that hump. It was insurmountable. And so I decided to pull a leaving Las Vegas and ended up in that apartment and pawned almost all my belongings. Played my mom for as much money as I could until she finally cut myself off. And at that point, my body was on the brink of failure and shutdown. And in my case, just blood poisoning. My nervous system had lost the capacity to my body to metabolize the poisons that I was subjecting it to. So I was, in May, I ended up at the hospital, Northwestern, downtown Chicago, and I had to have a friend drive me down there because I was so sick and incapacitated and dying of blood poisoning. And put myself on a hold. I was extremely suicidal. I was kind of on an active, passive, suicidal, leaving Las Vegas kind of rampage. And they were like, dude, they did my values and kind of assessed me. And they're like, there's no reason you should have been alive when you first got here. And so, but I left. I discharged AMA after my hold was up, and they were like, dude, you'll die in a week. You should have been dead when you got here, and we think you're going to continue drinking. You're not even done detoxing. You're going to die in a week. And I was awful, and just so I went at it for another 2 weeks. I lasted 2 weeks, but I was back on death's door, and I had seen my personal doctor, Dr. Wesley Cook. And Dr. Non-Feelgood. He was a really, really good doctor. And Dr. Non-Feelgood. This guy was awesome. He was real smart. You could not play this guy. He was a really good guy. And I kind of gave him half of my story. I was trying to play him for some benzos, which I don't even really care for. Okay. But I kind of told him half truths about struggling with alcohol use disorder, being in withdrawal. So he did give me a couple scripts. But on the way out, this was a Wednesday, he gave me a flyer for some AA meetings. And so I took it home, and then it was Friday, and I was out of booze. I was out of money. I had pawned everything that I was willing to pawn. I was on death's door. I had some Librium, so I had some meds to stabilize myself. And so I got to an AA meeting at the Mustard Seed off of North Avenue. It's still there, legendary AA joint. It's kind of like crack smoking AA.
Really?
Yeah, it's not like BMW, like Woodbury, like suburbs kind of AA.
So it's the most NA AA meeting?
It's just like raw, AA. Maybe it's different now, or I'm being judgy, but that's what it felt like when I was there. And so I ended up at this meeting. And this man named Michael, he's dead now. He's like a child psychologist, a little bit older. And he was telling his story, and his story was insane. It was wild. I mean, I couldn't relate personally to some of the things that he had done, like getting away with involuntary manslaughter. He was like, he killed somebody driving and then got off on a legal technicality. He was like, drinking and blowing lines of coke before treating your child as a psychologist. He had, prostituted himself out for fun, he said. I mean, just some really dark stuff. But I remember being there and just being in that raw and depleted and broken place, and so relating to the rawness and the authenticity and the illness and the disease that he was testifying about. And I'd been to meetings before, but it was that moment where I was like, oh my gosh, like this is big, this is powerful. Like I relate, like I'm on that level. I'm that dirty. I'm that broken. And so I went out to smoke a cigarette, and this brother, I was about 25, and this brother reached out to me, and he was just living in the 12 step. And he was like, what's going on? And I was like intolerable. I was like really, really unwell and really snarky and cynical, to say the very least. And he was like, how you doing? And I was like, I'm on a rampage. He was like, okay. And he just, he was just like, what's up? And shared a little bit about himself. And he was like, what are you doing tomorrow? And I was like, besides killing myself? And he was like, yeah, besides killing yourself. And I was like, I don't know. And he was like, well, why don't you come back tomorrow? Meet me at the Mustard Seed at noon, and we'll hang out. And I was like, for real? He was like, for real. And so I went home, took a Librium. And then the next day I woke up, it was May 31st, 2008. Body screaming. I think I was finally at zeros. It took me about 48 hours to get to zeros because I was such an alcoholic and my body was so taxed at metabolizing the liquor. So I took a Valium, went downtown, and didn't bring any meds with me. Totally not planning. And that night, he introduced me to a large young people's fellowship of AA. There's this little joint called Hazelden off of Dearborn, downtown Chicago, and they had a meeting room outside. And I went into this little meeting space, tiny little room with like 50 young people. Saturday night meeting, never took a legal drink was the name of the meeting. These people clearly knew each other. They loved each other. The energy was like off the charts, happy, laughing. I mean, rainbows shooting out of everybody's ears. It was such a stark contrast to like my dying state. And so the withdrawal was so bad. In that meeting, I had to sit on my hands and I was crying.
You were in full-fledged alcohol withdrawal.
Yeah, I totally forgot to bring more Librium with me.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's painful. Did you hallucinate at all?
Yeah, a week later.
Wow.
Yeah.
So you went into the really serious longer term hallucinations and stuff.
It was, it was wild. I'd never done a self-administered, detox. I'd always put myself in treatment or a hospital to do that. So it was miracle after miracle those first couple of weeks. But that first night after the meeting, I was talking to this gentleman named John, and he had 18 months sober. He had a sponsor. He'd worked the steps. He was calm. He was collected. He was like really comfortable in his skin. I could tell that. He wasn't fronting. And he had a job. He had a significant other. Like, he had a life. I was like, man, I want that, And I knew what the deal was. I've been to treatment. Like, ask him to sponsor you. Ask him to mentor you and help you out. And I couldn't. Like, I was literally willing to die before I asked for help. There was just something so rigid and so insane about me that I couldn't ask for help. And I swear, you ever seen like those weird videos, where people are talking in tongues and they're all possessed and whatnot? It was kind of like one of those moments. And I was like, will you sponsor me? And it was like something spoke through me. It was this weird moment. And he was like, what did you say? And I was like, I think I asked you to sponsor me.
Oh.
Yeah, it was like
asking for help.
Yeah, asking for help. Yeah, so I think something had to overcome me and speak through me. It was a weird moment.
You had to be possessed by a good ghost, a friendly ghost or something. That wants to help you.
And he was like,
I know what that's like.
Yeah, he was like. But he took me under his wing. He was a hard-nosed sponsor. He was really hard on me, which was good. It was a perfect mix because I had like at least 8 feet of barriers and BS and defenses and metaphorical mask. And he was able to cut through all of that. And constantly, I would leave the meetings at night and go home with my tail between my legs. But I get home and think it over, and I was like, it's not about me versus him, and he doesn't even care to be right. It's like he's just trying to tell me the truth. He's trying to help me see more clearly so that I can save myself. And so I started leading into that. And that first week, they employed me. Started working for a businessman in AA. Working day to day with another brother in AA, just doing industrial cleaning and construction work and that sort of thing. And it was really hard. And so that's how I detoxed, was on a job site, doing a self-administered Librium taper, nothing for the heroin. So it was brutal those first couple of weeks. Yeah, and a week later, I was back at that Saturday meeting. I got there earlier, and I was at a park across the street, and I think I was having like an LSD like flashback. I did a lot of hallucinogens in the late 90s, so it was kind of that going on, and so like there were portals, and I was like in a full-on like flashback, and I was in withdrawal, and yeah, there was this big portal, and I was like rocking out some music, like trying to keep my ish together. And I kind of knew what was going on, so I wasn't like super scared, but I was just like really, like on top of everything else. The hardest thing was getting sober in that apartment by myself. If you are ambivalent about sober living, but you have like the means and maybe the familial support to do that, like, please do it. It's not impossible. I mean, people get sober all the time, sometimes on their own and doing their own thing. But it's just my observation is that we do better in numbers. We do better with support. And we know one of those top correlates for relapse is relationships and accessibility to substances. And then, even if you don't necessarily have that in your home environment, you're like, dude, I got to do my own thing and be in my own place. I get that. But your memory mechanisms can't help, but form a deeply ingrained context with that environment. So if you've just been using and drinking and you're on that couch in that apartment, and then you're sitting on that couch in that apartment alone trying to get sober, your hippocampus, your amygdala, like your nervous system is like, I know what we do.
Mm.
And that drives like a persistent, low, mid-grade kind of craving, this dissonance that something's missing. So a lot of cravings are like an iceberg. It's what's happening below the surface, what's happening in your body. And then stress is hitting, you're depleted, physiological burnout, downregulated dopamine, pause is really coming on, let alone trying to detox in your own environment. So if you have any means and any capacity to get some treatment, to put yourself in a safe environment, nobody wants to go to sober living. I totally get that. It's just about how can I meet my basic needs and get myself out of over those common humps that befall so many people in early recovery. It's not you, like, oh, you're sick enough that you need this. It's just like, who wouldn't in that circumstance? But I had to get sober in that same apartment, and the only context in those 2 months was death and destruction. And so I'd go to work and I'd work with this cat named Ramon, and it was basically an all-day meeting and just like working out my body and doing construction. Then me and Ramon would go to a young people's meeting, and that's when I felt safest with about 50 other people they were kind of my surrogate of peace and stability and sanity and objectivity. But then I would go home to that apartment and I would explode in cravings, because that was when I really, really rocked it too. I drank and used all day, but at night was when I'd really go for it and then pass out. And so, of course, my body was deeply conditioned. Joe, it's nighttime, or how are we going to fall asleep? So I had horrible sleep disturbances, lots of insomnia, lots of dysregulated sleep, night terrors, using dreams, but that's how I got sober. And it was one miracle after another. And were it not for the Young People's Fellowship of AA on the north side of Chicago, a higher power that I came to know in that first year, and all the other people that I'm not thinking of at the moment that supported me, it feels like half of Chicago. But that's what it took me to get over that hump and initially lay the groundwork and the foundation for my recovery, which I'm still building upon today. Endlessly grateful for that experience and those people. Still connected with a lot of them.
Wow, that's great.
Yeah.
Never a legal drink, was it?
Never took a legal drink.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's easy to get drugs in Chicago. You just go to certain parts of town, but it can actually be harder to get booze, because liquor stores aren't willing to risk their liquor license selling to underage kids. There's not a whole lot of incentive for them to risk it.
Right.
So there was a lot of AA kids it was an AA meeting, right, but they hadn't necessarily drank. But I was in a pretty liberal fellowship where they weren't too concerned about alcoholic addict or whatever. If you were there and you were participating, at least to the groups that I got sober in, that's all that really mattered.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Interesting story. Wow, it's so good to hear it. How about your first use of substances? I think you already kind of talked about that. Do you remember the first time you ever took any kind of drug?
Yeah. Probably speaks to just the unhinged person that I've been by history. The first drug that I ever did was LSD. And no one told me it was all in your head. Like, that's the worst thing you can do to prep somebody to do like a very powerful hallucinogen, is to, not plant a seed with them and just being like, this this substance is going to mess with your literal sense of reality and self. So just know that that's a facet of what this drug does. No context.
How old were you?
I was 15 or 16. Yeah. Probably about 15.
Why'd you choose that drug?
Well, I was dating, so I was a year ahead in terms of schooling. So when I started my sophomore year of high school, I was 15. I had been living in Vicenza, Italy. I grew up a military brat. My dad was an officer in our United States Army, and he was really good at that. So I moved about 7 times before I was a sophomore in high school, and he just happened to be stationed in Vicenza, Italy. That was his last assignment. He retired, and then he got into the business side of things, working with these engineering companies, trying to get big contracts from the DoD, that sort of thing. And so there's a lot of industry for that in Boston and Alabama, North Alabama. So we moved to North Alabama. That's what he chose. And so, yeah, that was a hard pivot, going from military brat style in small schools, small military schools, Catholic school, to a relatively large upper middle class suburb in Madison, Alabama,
Oh,
where
wow.
I did not fit in at all,
Mm.
and will never fit in. And it was tough. And Alabama's fine, but something about Alabama is that they need to figure you out. Like they need to know what your deal is.
Mm.
They can be really extroverted, very social, very kind, very friendly. But I think a part of that is to try and figure out like what's your deal, so they
Mm.
can understand you and maintain some sense of security. And they could not get a handle on me, and
Mm.
I was horrendously, undiagnosed autistic and depressed, treatment resistant depression. I had selective mutism, just like this paralyzing anxiety, auditory processing disorder, ADHD. Like I was just a dumpster fire of struggle, And I was like, and I'd sit around with my mouth open. I was just really disconnected and not processing information. So when they met me, they were just like, I don't know, dude. So I was never, ever a part of that community. And so the senior took me under her arm kind of as a project, and then hooked me up to date this girl. And she was a year older and had a car, and she had experimented a couple times with LSD. And so it was because of her, and she was able to, and it was late at that time at Alabama, there was just a huge influx of paper LSD at the time. Like there was tons of it. The whole market was flooded with it. It was like $2 a hit. It was pretty strong stuff. So it was just in the community at that time. This was before the wave of ecstasy and MDMA took over around my senior year. So it was sort of an unfortunate serendipity or circumstance that the person I was with, and so yeah, and then that night, so she got me a hit, and I took it. It was
Were
just
you afraid of it at all?
no, she kind of managed it up and had gone to a couple raves and like was going on, and we'd have these talks as we started dating. We'd hang out at the park, and she was telling me about these experiences, and I was like, okay,
You just
and
wanted out. Let's escape.
well, let's just try it,
Mhm.
and I had to keep it a secret because both my parents, like, not drinkers, that had never used substances, just real clean cut folks, really super supportive, loving, brilliant people. But I had to keep it from my lieutenant colonel father. Like I had to keep it a secret. So I always knew that from the very beginning that whatever I did with substances, it was going to have to be a secret, and I was going to have to maintain the status quo. And so it was an awful experience, Justin. It was really bad. It was a bad trip.
Oh,
They
wow.
weren't on it, and I had this guy I was friends with, Reggie, and so I was hanging out with Reggie. I was hanging out with that girlfriend. We ended up over at his house, and I had the onset, and I had no inkling or preparation for what it was going to do to me. So I was having a little bit of a break. And Reggie lived in this brand new, built house, and he basically had a bachelor pad down in the basement, fully furnished, great stuff. His parents were way upstairs, and I was flipping my lid. And Reggie was like, "Dude, I was like in the corner of the bathroom, like scared out of my mind." And he was like, "Dude, you're gonna have to pull it together." And so I
Oh,
kind of
wow.
reined it in, and then they put me on a couch in front of the TV, and MTV Videos was on, and Marcy's Playground was playing, and it was just it's a trippy music video, hallucinogens notwithstanding. And it was just this massive old school TV. It was just enormous. I don't even know how you'd move it. And then I had that experience of 3D visuals, and I kind of calmed down, and it was an absolutely horrific, like scary experience. And I did it the next weekend.
Wow, you have lived through many levels of hell on earth.
Yeah.
And that first trip, it was not the warning. I mean, maybe the acid was trying to give you a warning of what was to come if you kept going down that path.
Foreshadowing, huh?
Yeah.
Yeah. Here's the epilogue. Yeah, here's the prologue.
So we don't listen to that. We keep going. Now that we're, okay, we've told your story in reverse, which whatever. It's interesting to hear it that way, I guess.
Yeah.
To see where it all began, because you just told us about all the other suffering you went through, and to relieve that suffering, let's talk about advanced reciprocal inhibition. That's kind of like your baby that you're working on right now.
Yeah. I've just not to boohoo me, but I've suffered like a lot, and I think that's why I have like a really, really deep well of compassion and agape and love for the people that I help and humanity in general is just because I've suffered so much in my life before addiction. And that was some of the worst of it. It sucks when things are going on and you're facing hardship and you don't know what you don't know. That's brutal. You're just in the dark, getting pushed around. You're just like, oh my God, you just don't know what you don't know. And then addicted suffering, and then all that underlying suffering. That's a whole thing. John Mulaney's stand-up's pretty good, especially when he's talking about recovery, and he's talking about the difference between addicted suffering and recovery suffering. And in addicted suffering, at least you got the substances to take off the edge, to numb you out, to dissociate, to elevate. But suffering. And I got sober in '08. And I've done horrible suffering in my recovery because it took me forever to get a handle and figure out my differential diagnoses. I was diagnosed with ADHD in 2000, went through a month of forensic testing with a doctor that specialized in attention deficit in young men. And so that was helpful. So I knew that about me. Didn't necessarily learn skills and insights around how to really skillfully deal with attention deficit hyperactive disorder. I knew I had treatment-resistant depression. Like, this was not, news to me. Since 9 years old, just major depressive episodes, 3 to 4 a year since I was 9 years old. I knew that I didn't respond well to medications, mostly serotonergic medication, SNRIs. Just did nothing to me. And then I was diagnosed at the end of 2019. I think it was January 2020, right before the pandemic hit. I went to the Autism Society in Minnesota and got an assessment and verified that I have autism spectrum disorder, or I just say being autistic. And so that was a big awakening. That was like, oh my gosh, this makes so much sense. And, it's good to know you're a zebra and not like a really weird, illed out horse, And so, okay, I'm a zebra. All right, I'm a zebra. I'm ADHD. There's really high coincidences of autism and ADHD. So I was like, okay, that makes sense. All of these struggles that I've had, but I could not get a handle on my treatment-resistant depression, 30, 40 different medications up at this point. 2019, I had to leave Center City. I was enormously burnt out. I was not taking care of myself. I did take care of myself, but not in the ways that I needed, and it caught up with me. I also developed a severe case of post-traumatic stress disorder. And that's a long story about how I got into it. But the point is that I ended up extremely depleted and empty. I was at, exhaustion. I was at the stage of trauma where you enter collapse, where basically your nervous system completely shuts down, and I couldn't get out of bed. May of 2019, I started doing electroconvulsive therapy, switched up all my meds, and then I just spiraled back in. It helped, to a certain extent. But I went back to that job and back to my ways of coping, which were not sufficient. And I spiraled, and it got really, really bad to the point where I could not function as a residential counselor anymore by the fall of 2019. Relapse rates with ECT, or electroconvulsive therapy, are as high as 80%. So that's a well-known thing, but it's also still to this day, not a lot of people maybe know that it's still a common intervention that's used today.
So electroconvulsive therapy, the relapse of depression after, as in like you will get symptoms after again, 80%?
You'll relapse back into your pathology.
Okay. And how do they define relapsing? Like another month of it, or like you go back into it for a long time?
You just go back into your cycling,
okay.
or
so you need more ECT?
Yeah. So they talk about maintenance at ECT.
Okay.
And that is something, it's a pretty intense intervention. And it's not like Requiem for a Dream. They're going to put you under, they're going to induce, a single or bilateral induced seizure, ideally for about a minute to a minute and a half. They're going to bring you out of it. And that's the bigger thing, is just having to be put under and then having to have someone pick you up, take you home, because you're going to be woozy from
I'm
the
thinking
anesthesia.
that sounds great. I got to try that.
Yeah, you got to try that. And even done right, there's really high rates of memory disordered memory and memory gaps. And so that was true. It can really do a number on your hippocampus. And so on the one hand, it's theorized it can maybe reset the nervous system, or maybe get in there real deep in the weeds and maybe work against whatever pathology you're dealing with, because they use it for a lot of different illnesses. But in my case, I just would relapse back into persistent depressive disorder with chronic and increasingly severe intermittent depressive episodes. So just severe double depression. You know? On top of being ADHD, on top of being autistic, and so just a lot of layers of struggle, but that was killing me. And so the next couple of years, and so I got out of residential and then moved down to St. Paul, working out an outpatient. Then the pandemic hit, and then we all became virtual counselors. And then it was just a number of years just trying to figure it out. And once I transitioned to St. Paul, I literally started meditating. My body had gotten in the habit of waking me up, a severe anticipatory stress response, like halfway through the night. So every morning at 3:00, my body would jump me awake. Severe cortisol response, severe adrenaline response, heart beating, and it would be like that every single night for the next couple of years. It was brutal. And so my body was going to be up. I usually had to get up at 6 to leave at 7 to get to Center City by 8. So my body was going to be up anyway. So December of 19, when I pivoted to St. Paul, I'd been a yogi for about 4 to 5 years, and I had been working towards a sitting practice. That was kind of a goal of mine. And I was like, now's the time. So I got a meditation cushion, and I just started sitting. I didn't really study, had no Dharma teacher. Those first 2 years, I was just trying to figure it out. So for the next couple of years, I sat every single day for about 50 minutes. So I was religious about it. It was so brutal because of the sleep deprivation. I did another sequence of ECT sessions. I've done 26 in my lifetime. There was a period when I did 37 sessions of transcranial magnetic stimulation. Which helped a little bit, but then the relapse back into just me was absolutely horrible and super demoralizing. I was really going all in with my psychiatrist and trying to figure out what I had. And so we knew antidepressants didn't work on me. So now I'm trying lots of mood stabilizers. I'm trying lots of antipsychotics. I tried doing MAOI inhibitors, which helped, but unfortunately I don't metabolize them correctly. I'm a slow metabolizer, so I couldn't tolerate them. And then it was during this experience that I was on a mood stabilizer, which I knew I didn't metabolize correctly. I got GeneSight, so it can tell you if you're a rapid, a slow metabolizer or something. And I was on Lamictal and a pretty high dose and I couldn't really tolerate it because I was a high metabolizer of that. But there was this period while I was on Lamictal that I had textbook bipolar 2. With mixed episodes where I was manic and severely depressed at the same time. And so that obviously wasn't a pleasant experience, but it was a big aha to me. I was like, oh my gosh, I don't just have treatment-resistant major depressive disorder. I have to have some form of bipolar, but that's so weird because, if it wasn't substance-induced, I've never been manic before. I've never even been hypomanic before. And so come to find out, statistically, most people that have bipolar disorder have a sub-threshold manifestation of it. When we think bipolar, we think Bradley Cooper and the movies. And
he gets really emotionally upset about
yeah.
like a book because he thinks it's relating to the outcome of his love life, right? He's attached to those kind of external, I guess, not approval, but like external locus of... Yeah, he gets very, very uncontrollably upset about things. But I think it kind of feels like he was struggling to feel intense pain. Like it's like he was trying not to feel it. So he was his angry part of him was taking over, right? And throwing a temper tantrum.
Yeah.
Because he couldn't control that his wife was gone.
Yeah.
But that's just my take on it. But that's my favorite movie. I love Silver Linings Playbook.
Yeah,
It's
it's
so
a great movie.
brilliant.
And so, bipolar can make for, you know, thematic and interesting plots and storylines. But most people that have bipolar just have, I don't want to say a minor, because there's this idea that bipolar 2 is somehow less severe in its manifestation than bipolar 1, and that's just not the case. Bipolar is bipolar. It's relative to the person, and regardless of whether it's subthreshold, bipolar 2, bipolar 1, it can be life-threatening. It can be absolutely disabling and incapacitating. Regardless of the manifestation and the type of pathology and the way it manifests. And so me with my double depression, my low hedonic tone, I would get manic. So I came to find later on in my own mental health journey as a professional, I have what's called other specified bipolar disorder with hypomanic episodes not meeting full criteria. So that's the diagnosis, that's the specifier. And I was like, that is so validating,
Mm.
And so I wonder how many people out there have seemingly ultra treatment resistant major depressive disorder, and they are experiencing subthreshold hypomania. But for that, what did it look like? I just temporarily felt normal for, 1 to 2 weeks.
Okay.
And we know that the bipolar person doesn't respond typically to serotonergic medications, the first line intervention for depression. In fact, it can trigger mania in them.
Yeah.
Serotonin activating dopamine. So all of that was going on. And so I was looking at my mental health journey, because it's been a hell of a ride the last 5 years, and I've had a mental health journey, a medication journey, a meditation journey, just keeping track of all of that. And it was February of 2023 when I circled back around with an antipsychotic I had previously tried, but had struggled with some side effects. So I was like, I'm not doing it. But it did do something. And so I circled back around that with my psychiatrist, and it was really hard. It was really hard to get to that therapeutic threshold that I needed. And I had to go up really, really slowly. And I did get some meds and get some solutions to deal with to offset the side effects that I was dealing with. And but once I got up to that dosage that I needed, that dose that I needed of that antipsychotic, it's been arrested. And so my bipolar has been arrested for 2 years now. And if I'm still cycling, and I think on some extent I'm still cycling, whether it's subthreshold hypomania and depression, but I'm so well contained that I can't tell. So that's a miracle. And so it was around this time. So I've meditated for 2 to 3 years, and then things aligned, and I figured out the med that I needed. And then I stumbled upon, Peter Levine and his somatic experiencing methodology. So I read In an Unspoken Voice. And so if you really want like an awesome book on healing from trauma, Bessel van der Kolk's The Body Keeps the Score is obviously seminal, is must read. And that for me explained kind of like the what of trauma, but it didn't, necessarily give me the how do I get out of it. And for me, reading Peter Levine and somatic experiencing in sum is basically a form of mindfulness with a therapist, where you're incrementally just small bits of information at a time. You're inhaling that trauma activation, and then you're inducing a deep state of relaxation and mindfulness into it, and it squashes it. And then that trauma is renegotiated and sent home to long-term memory. It's flushed from your body. And when we flush trauma out from our body, we're opening ourselves to vitality, a sense of aliveness, body and aliveness that was otherwise unavailable to me because it was caught up and bound down by the trauma itself. So I figured out what I got and mental health wise, and then I finally found the med. And hang in there, y'all. Seriously, like I have a list of all the medications that I've tried, and it took me 40 medication trials to find the 2 medications that I take today. And ironically, they're $10 a month.
What can I ask? What the difference is in an example of a form of suffering that you had that now that you have this medicine you no longer have in your day-to-day life?
Yeah, just it's brutal because they have this kindling theory, or when it comes to major depressive disorder, which is, by the way, the #1 disability in the entire world, is major depressive disorder. And most people with bipolar are also diagnostically going to meet criteria for major depression. If they just overlap, it's the same. Just it's a matter of whether you experience hypomania or subthreshold mania. It may be being a form of bipolar. So since I was 9 years old, just the anhedonia, like the double depression, that's just what was brutal. Living with double depression, and some people say you can't have double depression when you have bipolar. I'd like to beg to differ. I lived that since I was 9 years old. Yeah, I was just like persistent depressive disorder overlapped with subthreshold bipolar, and so since I was 9 years old, 3 to 4 times a year, I'd have several weeks of severe depressive episodes. And it did not align with the things in my life. I did have those experiences where I was going through something, a loss, a pain, a suffering, and yeah, it would spurn a depressive episode. Like that's a part of our human experience to go into depressive episodes. But what's unique in major depression is that they're not aligned with anything happening in your life. Your stress mechanisms, your hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, your HPA axis gets going and it starts facilitating depressive episodes regardless of what's going on in your life. So they call it the kindling theory, where there's just a little bit of a fire and you have a stressor in your life, a relocation, a parent goes to prison, you're growing up in a mentally unstable house. That'll trigger your HPA axis. You'll be in a depressive episode. But for the persons with MDD and bipolar, that fire takes hold and then it gets dysregulated, and it becomes, at least in my experience, permanently dysregulated, where no matter what I did, what was happening in my life, I would have 3 to 4 major depressive episodes, severe declines in my mental well-being, like anyone would be in a depressive episode, from 9 years old until now I'm in my late 30s. It's just brutal. It's just being brutalized by a disease. So being robbed of personal autonomy, a sense of control. And if you've ever been through a depressive episode and your appetite, your energy, your stress is out the wazoo, you can't think clearly. And it just makes life enormously difficult just to function at a baseline level. Yeah.
Is it nice to work surrounded by a bunch of therapists then when you're going through that?
When I first went down to St. Paul, I was just so sick and so traumatized and so sleep deprived. I don't know, I felt isolated amongst my community that I was, singing their praises earlier. So I guess that's another downside to just being that sick with what, I've been dealing with, is how disconnected I feel from myself, and thus how disconnected I am from everyone around us. Those two are inextricably, intertwined. My sense of connection with me will bear fruit with my capacity to connect with others, and around I go. But if I am just drowning in myself, and that's how I kind of characterize it to myself, and I'd call my mom, I'd call whoever, and I'm like, I'm drowning. And so most of my life in my depression and my mental illness at worst, it's like you're in the deep end of the pool, or you're way out in the ocean and it's dark and you're treading water and you're losing energy and you're about to drown. That's what it was like for years and years and years. And then it was compounded by the severe sleep deprivation and the post-traumatic stress those first couple of years. So I think one of the most courageous things I've ever done, period, recovery, just life, was those years sitting on my cushion and meditating into that. And trying to open to that, whether it was Thich Nhat Hanh or the Dalai Lama or Jack Kornfield or some of my favorite teachers. If I learned anything from them, it's the principle of this too. So trying to incrementally but courageously and open to all aspects of our human experience. And there was just so much pain and so much depletion and uncertainty and fear to lean into. And it's a longer, deeper story about going through all of that. But what happened? How did I come up with a methodology to renegotiate the trauma in my body? I think I was doing it to a certain extent the whole while, sitting on my cushion, cultivating the principles of meditation as I learned them from Dharma teacher Will Johnson, aligning my body. inducing a deep state of relaxation, that being the primary condition of meditation, relaxation, and then cultivating resilience, a little bit of movement in the body to sustain relaxation, to sustain alignment. And so these three principles bring about this wonderful experience of meditation. So that was a game changer. I didn't read that book until I was 2 years into my practice. Should have read it on the front end, but whatever. So that was a game changer. And then figuring out the meds was a game changer. And then I'm a big supplements guy, mostly supplements that are geared towards lowering baseline cortisol levels. Because once I arrested my bipolar, my body was still on fire with cortisol. Super bad for us. We know there's innumerable books being written now about how chronic inflammation is an indicator and a factor that pretty considerably raises your risk of a lot of different illnesses, cardiovascular disease, diabetes, certain forms of cancer, maybe even dementia. So it's not a really good thing. So then there was a journey of finding the supplements and the regimen of supplements that did lower my basal cortisol levels. So that really helped. And then reading Peter Levine's book and learning the principles of somatic experiencing, and then just a couple little nuggets of suggestion in there, and then introducing some yogi breathing practices, in particular Ujjayi pranayama. Which is the oceanic breath. It's a very textured breath where you constrict the back of your throat. Exactly. It's kind of like letting air out of a balloon, and it's really great for stimulating your vagus nerve. If you have a closed mouth, it's really great for generating heat in the body. We do that a lot during yoga. Keep your mouth closed. So Ujjayi pranayama was a game changer. It was like a little mention in an unspoken voice, vu, where you press your lips together and create a deep vibration. It's kind of like a vibration that you get with Om when you're in your yoga class and everybody's really leaning into an Om and you get that vibration. And it's from an ancient Chinese medicine kind of practice. I don't remember it off the top of my head, but he just very briefly mentioned that. And I was like, all right, let's try it. And it felt kind of goofy doing it, just meditating, boo. But it ended up being this powerful vibration and breath to help open energy and traumatic energies and sometimes open to something new. I think there was an enormous amount of trauma in me, like it was a huge iceberg, and I think me sitting in meditation was me sitting there with a hairdryer. And I was doing it, but it was so slow. I wasn't really sure about the fruits of my effort and being able to measure it. So that's what it felt like for those first 2 or 3 years meditating. I was slowly but surely melting. And I had a huge buildup of literal physical trauma in my body, starting from my right glute area and the bottom of my pelvis. That's where it started, all the way up through my chest and into my face. And that was the first thing to renegotiate and open in my trauma healing journey, was the trauma in my face. My nasal cavities cleared up and just this chronic inflammation in my face. It was about 2 to 3 months into meditating. And it was a really big aha moment. Like I felt it physically at the end of that session where it just something shifted and it was like, whoa. I was like, whoa. And so it was many years, literally 2 to 3 years of doing this, but the medication, the supplements, lowering my cortisol levels, reading in an unspoken voice, and then introducing those yogi breathings. That's how I stumbled on, an in vivo, in the moment way to not only identify trauma existing in my body in the moment, but having the power, the independence to breathe into it and renegotiate it in the moment. And that's advanced reciprocal inhibition. We got to breathe. In Buddhism, they believe the heart of emotion is in our heart space. Our modern neuroscience says it's maybe in the limbic system. I don't know. There's 20,000 neurons in our heart, so maybe we're somewhere in the middle. But that's a common place in our chest, in our throats, our necks, our shoulders, where we end up accumulating an enormous amount of repressed energies. I know that sounds hokey, it's all energy, man. But, emotions are regulated by chains of amino acids called peptides, and the peptide receptors are in your entire body. A neuropeptide is a neurotransmitter, so those are limited to their expression in the nervous system. Stress. And if we don't discharge our stress, it just accumulates in the body. And they contend so by way of chronic muscle tension. or you're just sitting at your desk and you're like, ugh, and you're bearing down and clenching your rear end or grinding your teeth or chewing the inside of your cheek like I do, that's just, and we muck up those receptors. That gets caught up in our fascia and our muscle tissue and in these parts of our body. In Buddhism, we talk about habit energies, and those can be uplifting and affirming, or they can be detrimental and reinforce downward spirals of illness and disease. And so in meditation, we're just bringing awareness, loving awareness, detached openness, some courage, some perseverance to those energies, and giving them, their time of day, and being like, yeah, I didn't honor you. I didn't give you a space to fully express yourself. And if I don't do that, you'll just continue to accumulate in my body. And so the principle of reciprocal inhibition was discovered by a British scientist, Sir Charles Sherrington. This was the early 20th century, and he won a Nobel Prize for it. And the principle goes that when you flex your bicep, your tricep is disengaged, those muscles. And then when you flex your tricep, your bicep is disengaged. And so there was a lot more to it, but he won a Nobel for that. And then there was a South African psychiatrist, this doctor named Joseph Wolpe. And so he advanced that idea and his methodology, and he used it with persons with obsessive compulsive disorder, severe anxiety, lots of different types of neuroses, as they called them at the day. This is in the early 1950s, that you could not be severely anxious and super loosey-goosey relaxed at the same time, like in your body and in your nervous system. So what he would do is he would train his patients to lots of progressive relaxation muscle techniques, basically training his people to induce a really deep state of relaxation, paradoxically, in the face of that severe anxiety and that OCD energy. And then he had great success. And so Peter Levine references Joseph Wolpe. And so he advanced and took that a little bit farther. How can we introduce some mindfulness? How can the therapist maybe act as a proxy of strength and stability? Because in session, a person is opening to sometimes big chunks of trauma. Working with trauma is inherently destabilizing. If you've never done it, don't want to deter you from doing it, but want to realistically prepare you for a lot of us, our experiences, activating that energy, bringing it up from the graveyard of our bodies where it's densely packed up, is activating a lot of dysregulating energy. If we look at the diagnostic criteria of PTSD, there's a whole section of physical expressions of it, racing heart rate, tightness, just generally not feeling safe, getting really hot, getting flush, all those sorts of things. So the only way out, in my experience with trauma healing, is through. But a little dab will do you, right? Just a little bit at a time. This is like one day at a time kind of stuff, 1 hour, 1 moment at a time. We're not jumping in the deep end of our trauma without our floaties in the dark. You're going to have a bad time. And kind of a tangent, but I've met a lot of patients in my job where they've maybe initiated EMDR with a therapist who didn't do any of the prep work. They didn't do any resource development. There's not any context. There's not any education. They're just jumping straight into the deep end, wanting to get to that bilateral, effort. And
which is really uncomfortable because they ask you to expose yourself to some of your worst memories, right?
It's not good to jump in the deep end when you don't even know what you're getting yourself into. And so, of course, they get destabilized and they're very deterred from ever doing that again. So Peter Levine's methodology is very incremental, is very holistic, and as needed, the therapist is working as a surrogate of strength and stability and guidance. But it's really a chill, intuitive process. I don't have to talk about my traumas, and it is a diagnostic marker of trauma not to remember your trauma. You're so overwhelmed with energies and cortisol in your body, the hippocampus pretty sensitive to cortisol, that it can, malfunction and go off. And so people are acutely, or in the instances of just severe unremitting stress, which was the case for me, my hippocampus was not working properly, and I've never had a wonderful working hippocampus. I've never been a great sleeper, so I've always been challenged in my ability to form long-term memories and learn. But yeah, there's lots of bits of my trauma that I don't remember the specifics of. But the beautiful thing about trauma healing is that's not requisite for healing from it. What we need to heal is the energies that are stuck in the here and now. Trauma is just stuck here and now energy. Experiences in the past or in long-term memory. And we can recall them and it might be somewhat distressing, but then we can put that book back up on the shelf and then move on with our day. We get overwhelmed with a traumatic experience. I use the acronym a stinky fish. So there's fear, there's a fear-inducing situation, maybe a car accident. You get run off the road and you tumble, your car gets all crumpled up, you maybe have a compound fracture in your leg, and then you're immobilized, you know? So there's a fear-inducing situation, and then you're immobilized. You can't get out. You couldn't even if you want to. You have a compound fracture in your leg. So that's a horrible situation, being crumped up in a situation and you're freaking out. And then there's a severe stress response. So like cortisol receptors, glucocorticoids, your whole body is flooded with cortisol and adrenaline, literal energy. We're supposed to, when we have a severe stress response, we're supposed to act and discharge that stress. But what happens when you're terrified, you're immobilized, and you have a flood of energy? There's nowhere for it to go. And then there's a sense of helplessness, like you're robbed of autonomy. Like if you're being sexually assaulted, or you're in a war zone and your friends are dying, or you're in a car accident. So it's not definitive. You and I could go into a situation that's potentially traumatizing, and I could come out fine and you could be traumatized. All right. So there are, I get really annoyed when people are like, that must have been traumatizing. Don't define other people's experiences. Be curious about theirs. It might very well have been, but I don't want to project that onto anybody, because how many people go into a war zone? I think it's 1 out of 4 of our service members upwards maybe have post-traumatic stress or a stressor-related disorder. So I got to be careful around. I get that term just gets usually thrown around these days in pop psychology and on TikTok, but those are kind of the principles that can lead to post-traumatic stress, and that was the case for me. So advanced reciprocal inhibition, I'm just advancing somatic experiencing. I'm advancing the idea that you can't simultaneously be deeply relaxed and traumatized at the same time. And so what happens is it's a paradox. And it's hard because it takes a lot of courage and a lot of willingness and a lot of determination, especially when you were as sick as I was. And you were that severely sleep deprived as I was, to even get up in the morning and sit on your cushion and be that willing to sit with energies. That's the kind of stuff that I'm talking about. But, it's one day at a time kind of stuff. It's one session at a stuff. But you inhale, you're going to activate. Your heart's going to beat a little bit faster. You're going to inhale the oxygen. It's going to oxygenate the blood. It's going to go where it needs to go. And then we function. And then we exhale. Everything's going to slow down, your heart rate, and you're going to hopefully have some healthy heart rate variability. A lot of meditations focus on the exhale, because that's how we pump the brakes. That's how we really activate the parasympathetic. We strengthen the vagus nerve. So I too, using the breaths, whether it's Ujjayi Pranayama, really leaning into Vu, and then the third breath is what I call now Mokanam breath. And so Mokanam is Sanskrit. It means a couple of things, but I really like the idea, the symbol of it meaning release. And so that's what I'm doing these days. I'm on the home stretch, Justin, of my trauma healing journey. I got a little bit up in my right glute, and it's constantly active, but it's totally manageable. But I've otherwise almost entirely cured my post-traumatic stress disorder. I do have some dysregulated sleep. Sometimes my body will release and soften some trauma when I'm trying to go to sleep. My heart will start racing, and it makes it a little bit harder to go to sleep when your heart's racing. But I hardly ever have nightmares. I don't have night terrors anymore. I feel safe in my body. I feel in control of my body. We could go through the diagnostic criterion for post-traumatic stress, and I no longer meet criteria, but I can feel it right now in that hip. I was meditating on it this morning, just patiently trying to finish and renegotiate that last bit of trauma in my body. So whether it's those 3 breaths, but that's mostly what I'm doing these days. Mokanam breath is basically just open mouth Ujjayi Pranayama. and that can be a really big thing in yoga. Sometimes you get really hot and you're maybe doing closed mouth ujjayi pranayama, building up a lot of heat and energy in your body. So they're like, all right, let's take a deep inhale and then exhale through your mouth and release that heatness and that whatnot. And so those are the 3 breaths. And I do have a prescribed sequence. I have a prescribed, set of music to listen to. I like to listen to music. I loved the breathing sequence. I loved having something tangible and focused to do in my meditation. This is not just do whatever you want, insight, pay attention to whatever happens meditation. A lot of people struggle with that because that's hard. From the get-go, my practice with meditation has been counting my breaths, has been engaging in sequenced intentional breath practices. And then for the last couple of years, once I figured out how to in vivo have a lot of control and say over directly renegotiating trauma, that's what I've been wholeheartedly focused on. So having an intention in my meditation has bolstered my meditation practice because I have something intentional to focus on, which just bears an enormous fruit of mindfulness, just being engaged in the moment and being really present with what comes up. Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
Well, we're pretty much done. I'm going to ask one last question just because I think it might be interesting to hear your answer. Do you think it's possible to change an addictive personality?
Yeah. I actually worked with the therapist that wrote that book, Craig Nacken. He's a retired Jedi Master now, Native American man, longtime social worker and therapist, and he wrote the book, The Addicted Personality. And technically, I learned in grad school that they did a study around that, and there's different personality types, and there's lots of different forms and makeups of what those are. And so I think they found at the end of the day that addicted people maybe share 2 personality characteristics, which isn't hardly enough to constitute a personality type. So I think there's, again, those people that have a higher proclivity towards addiction. And those are the people with a high ACE score, an adverse childhood event score. Those are the people that have low hedonic tone. These are the people that have mental illness, people with neurodivergence, autistic folks. This is based on Scandinavian data. They're at double the risk of addiction relative to neurotypical people. And almost every autistic person I've met has at least 4 or 5 other diagnoses, whether it's mental illness or physical health, or it's complicated. It's a lot. It's a lot to figure out, and it's a lot to regulate. So no wonder those persons are at a way higher risk of maybe more deeply resonating with intoxication. But I love, did you read Dopamine Nation by Anna Lembke?
I just did. Yeah.
So she kind of talks to that, where, because how we define recovery is getting more fluid and diverse, and I'm here for it. I have my best practices and how I personally define it, and I'm open to different variations of how people define that. If it works for them and it's truly health affirming and gets them where they want to go, I'm here for it. But I think that's a really great book that captures the larger spirit of maybe the addicted personality, just as a culture that is more prone to chasing our tails with algorithms, which are specifically designed to modulate our reward center and dysregulate it. So we at times irrationally want to consume more or can't put the device down. Our foodstuffs, they're food products. They're really challenging the notion of what constitutes food by its legal definition. They're designing foods that are high in fat and sugar and calories that are working over our reward centers in an addictive way. They're even thinking of maybe having an ultra processed foods use disorder. They're considering that for maybe the next DSM because these foods are inducing a withdrawal syndrome, cravings, irrational compulsive behavior, just like substances do, or pornography, or what have you. So an addicted personality, I don't know. I just think you got to look at the person and you got to look at what's going on for their health. There's a large heritability that's involved with addiction. Anywhere between 50 and 60% is inheritable. There was no addiction in my family, not a lot of it, maybe over here. So you can have no genetic predisposition and still get it. But yeah, if you have a high genetic predisposition, if you have a lot of mental illness, if you generally are like, yeah, I kind of resonate with having lower than normal hedonic tone, if you have ADHD, if you're neurodivergent, just like on paper, you're going to have a higher risk of becoming addicted or struggling in regulating your pleasure response, maybe with porn or with money or with social media or with your phone. And I think that's what's more important, is that we bring a lot of compassionate awareness to who we are and what that is, for better or for worse. So at least we know what we're dealing with. And this is like a really big ask in our healthcare system and in our current state of affairs. We're all flying by the seat of our pants, and we're all living paycheck to paycheck. And I'm really disheartened by the anti-compassion sentiment that's kind of taken over right now. We haven't been doing good as a country around investing in collective security. You know? I think that's a beautiful and worthwhile intrinsic investment, to invest in education. I don't care if I'm old and I don't have kids. Like, I want my community to have educated people. I want those same people to be taken care of and healthy, because it's all going to bear fruit for us as a larger people. And in Buddhism, we call that inner being. We all inner are. We're all a delicate ecosystem. And we know that on our planet Earth. I mean, if we lose bees, we're in big freaking trouble, like, it is that delicate. And I don't know why we can't see that as a really beautiful and diverse, heterogeneous ecosystem of people, where we're creating vulnerable and divergent people and different orientations and identifications. And we're saying that that's a bad thing. A healthy ecosystem in biology is a diverse one. So I hope in the future that we can be far more compassionate and attuned to those really interesting expressions of humanity, and that maybe we go all in and make it an investment in one another as a larger whole. And it's kind of like an AA. If I can get outside of myself and really focus on others, indeed, there is a personal benefit that I will open up to. But the only way that I can tap into it is by getting outside of myself, caring about other people, and really going to bat for that. And so we know that as recovering people that have lived in the spirit of the 12th step. I just wish, as a larger culture, as a people, we could bring that and invest in one another. And not because it'll bear a financial benefit necessarily, but because it'll result in a people benefit. So that's my hope.
Thank you, Joe Caravella, for bringing us your knowledge, your wisdom, and your passion.
Hey, thanks for having me.
I'm glad we got to have Joe sit down with us today. He really was generous with his energy and time, and I love the way that he talks about this stuff. And looking forward to Joe's next book. Can't disclose the name of his next book, but I'm excited for his next book. And you can check out his first book, The Disease of Addiction, which goes into a 21st century description and understanding of the 12 steps and the brain disease of addiction and all that kind of stuff.